Were Jews ever ruled by a monarchy?
The thorny issue of monarchy arose during the later years of the Judges, c. 1200 to 1000 BCE, who ruled Israel after Joshua had led the establishment of the people in the newly reached promised land of Canaan. Some argued that Israel should be like all the surrounding lands, each ruled by its own king. They saw no other solution to the lawlessness they believed had overcome their land. Others held on to the conviction that embracing the institution of monarchy would amount to a betrayal of God's sovereignty. Saul was the first king, r. 1020 to 1000. From his capital at Gilgal he succeeded in uniting the tribes against the common enemy, the Philistines. David, r. 1000 to 961, established himself first at Hebron. But after taking Jerusalem from the Jebusites declared that city his capital. He sought to unify Jewish religious life and instituted the office of court prophet. David's son Solomon, r. 961 to 922, further centralized Jewish ritual in his newly built Jerusalem temple. But when Solomon died, his sons divided the realm into the northern kingdom of Israel, 922 to 721 BCE, and the southern kingdom of Judah, 922 to 586 BCE. 200 years later the northern capital of Samaria fell to the Assyrians, never to be recovered. The southern kingdom carried on for over a century, with moments of greatness and even major religious reform in the late 7th century BCE. Many of Israel's principal prophets lived and worked under the kingdom of Judah. But Babylon was putting the squeeze on the small kingdom. And in 586 BCE Jerusalem and its temple fell to invading forces. Over 1,000 years later, Jews founded the Khazar kingdom in the Caucasus. A small-scale experiment in monarchy that survived from about 700 to 1000.
What are the principal Jewish rites of passage?
Circumcision, giving a name, and redemption of the firstborn son are important early rites. To welcome older youngsters into full membership in the community. The most prominent rites are puberty or coming-of-age rituals. At that time a young boy becomes a son of the commandment, bar mitzvah. In a similar ritual a young girl becomes a daughter of the commandment, bat mitzvah, except in the Orthodox tradition. Confirmation still often acknowledges an older teenager's full maturity. Marriage rites continue to be important traditional practices, as do specific rites of departure from this life.
Do all traditions have savior figures or redeemers?
Virtually every tradition acknowledges that life is full of difficulties. But not all teach that someone else can rescue people from their problems. Theravada Buddhism. For example, emphasizes self-effort following the example of Buddha the teacher. Sunni Islam teaches that only surrender to God can bring a person's life to a good end. Some saviors, such as bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism, effect salvation for humanity purely by extending their power so that individuals are lifted out of their suffering. In those instances, the Savior remains largely above human misery. Some, such as Jesus Christ, work their saving deeds by redeeming or buying back a lost humanity. The notion of redemption presupposes that a savior figure spends him or herself as a kind of ransom. Identifying profoundly with the plight of humanity. This kind of redemptive suffering is relatively rare. Some traditions in which saints are prominent underscore the suffering of some holy persons. But they do not generally effect salvation through their pain.
Is there any further symbolism attached to the structure of the calendar?
Each month is divided into 10-day periods, 6 of those in turn considered a special time period, and 6 of those in turn equaling a full year. In addition, each year is divided into 24 climatic periods called breaths or nodes, described by such phrases as full of snow or clear and bright. Every year, month, day, and hour are further identified by a combination of 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches, the monthly or zodiacal symbols. The 10 heavenly stems are associated with colors. 2 stems with each of the 5 symbolic colors, azure, red, yellow, white, black, which are in turn linked to the 4 directions and center as well as to the 5 elements. Branches and stems are both primarily numerical designators, but each also bears important symbolic connotations. If you match one stem with one branch for succeeding years, S1/B1, S2/B2, S1/B11, S2/B12, S3/B1, and so on, you end up back at the beginning after 60 years. In this system, only odd-numbered stems combine with odd-numbered branches, even-numbered with even-numbered. We are currently in the 60-year cycle that began in 1984. The result of all this calculation is an extremely detailed system of pinpointing special times according to a host of definitive characteristics. Each event occurring on Earth has its heavenly parallel. For every conceivable type of human behavior there is an auspicious moment. The calendar has thus been not merely a way of keeping track of times for religious observances, but a kind of temporal map for negotiating the cosmos as well. Each year, during the 9th lunar month, imperial officials set up the liturgical calendar for the year to come.
What other early sacred texts are especially important for deists?
A text known as the Zhuangzi, named after the man whose disciples may have authored it, Dates from about the 4th century BCE. The work is also known as the Divine Classic of Nanhua. The town to which Zhuangzi was believed to have retired. Zhuangzi, the Daoist philosopher, c. 389–286 BCE, remains a relatively little-known figure. But the work that bears his name stands out as a foundational document in philosophical Daoism, whose interpretation of basic concepts also influenced many religious Daoists. In addition to its bold attacks on the inadequacy of Confucian teaching, the Zhuangzi presents essentially the same worldview as the Dao De Jing, especially the importance of non-effort, wu wei, or unmotivated action and its political implications. Zhuangzi emphasizes the concepts of longevity and immortality that would later take on great significance for many religious Daoists. Perhaps more important is the concept of mental purification called fasting of the heart. Zhuangzi's teaching has become an important element in Daoist mysticism, speaking often of a kind of oneness with the Dao. A Daoist philosopher named Li Zi is likewise said to have penned a work that bears his name. That book, also known as the true classic of the expanding emptiness, however, was almost certainly of a later time, and Li Zi is probably a legendary figure, containing materials of many different literary types, especially narrative forms such as anecdotes and parables. The book was probably compiled around 300 CE. Its 8 chapters arrange their literarily disparate materials thematically, addressing such topics as fate and human freedom, problems in establishing ethical standards, and the challenge of following the Dao. Here for the first time we hear of the Isles of the Blessed, home of the immortals. Like the Zhuangzi, the later work speaks at length about the complete freedom experienced in becoming one with the Dao.
Are any occasions associated with Muhammad especially important?
Since medieval times, Muslims in many countries have celebrated Muhammad's birthday, Mawlid an-Nabi, on the 12th of Rabi'i. Street parties and grand banquets often provide opportunity for special prayers and speeches. A very popular part of the festivities is the recitation of a poem by the 13th century Egyptian poet Bizari, the Burda, pronounced Biyurda, mantle. Translated into Swahili and a number of other languages. The poem sings the Prophet's praises in truly cosmic terms, attributing to his birth all manner of marvels and blessings. In some places, where festivities are minimized or forbidden altogether, even the Prophet's birthday is a kind of national holiday. On the 27th of Rajab, Muslims recall the night journey and ascension, Laylat al-Isra wal Miraj. According to traditional accounts, the Prophet experienced this timeless mystical moment sometime during the years just before the Hijrah. A major feature of the celebrations is the retelling of any of several narratives that follow. Gabriel and Muhammad through the heavens, including descriptions of his meetings and conversations with the other major prophets, each associated with one of the 7 celestial levels. During the course of his journey, Muhammad received special instructions about instituting the 5 daily ritual prayers.
What are santos?
Walk into virtually any small neighborhood or village, church anywhere in Latin America and you will find santos. Santos, Spanish for saints, are small carved, painted statues of holy persons specially revered because of their spiritual power and presence. You will generally see them lined up on shelves along the side walls of the church or occupying small side altars flanking the main altar. All who come to the church regularly are likely to have a particular favorite among the diminutive saints. Devotees are not shy about expressing their needs to their patrons, and these little churches are often alive with voices communicating in loud whispers every conceivable physical and spiritual need. People often light candles, soften the wax on the bottom so that they will stick to the floor, and proceed to harangue their santos with animated gestures, humbly demanding rain for the crops or asking why a sick child has not yet been healed. Santos are an important form of folk religious art that reveals a great deal about popular Christianity in the Americas. Cathedrals and wealthier churches have their equivalent of santos in their multiple side altars and shrines. But there the conversations are quieter. The candles mounted on racks, and the saints often protected behind glass.
Is there a Deist or CCT creed?
Since religious Daoism and CCT emphasize practice over correct belief, they have not formulated the equivalent of creedal summaries such as those of Judaism, Islam, and even Buddhism. Daoism and CCT do, of course, presuppose certain basic beliefs and assumptions about how the world works. Most of those beliefs have to do with discerning and understanding how to cope with and benefit from the spiritual forces inherent in all things. All of the varieties of religious Daoism and CCT, therefore, have their core beliefs. But affirming one's assent to them pales in insignificance when compared to the importance of grasping the essential skills needed to negotiate life's daily challenges.
What do Buddhists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
One of the many issues the Buddha refused to speculate on was the existence or significance of gods. As a Hindu, he naturally learned the traditional stories of the divinities. As a man of his time, with all its religious and intellectual ferment, the Buddha questioned the wisdom of reliance on ritual sacrifice. He did not deny the existence of the gods. he merely insisted that whatever power the gods might possess, it could not solve the fundamental human dilemma. That remained the sole responsibility of the individual person. Many Buddhist sacred texts talk of the gods in mythic terms. It was, for example, the gods who made sure young Siddhartha Gautama encountered the 4 passing sights that turned his life around. But classical Buddhist teaching does not refer to an ultimate reality in personal terms. That changed as popular devotional forms of Buddhism developed, especially in China, Korea, and Japan. Buddha himself assumed virtually divine proportions, and the concept of the universal Buddha nature superseded that of the Buddha as historical human teacher. Gods of ancient Hindu myth retained a place in the Buddhist spiritual cosmos but remained very much in the background.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Hindu?
A small dot on the forehead, called a bindu or bindai, is perhaps the most common individual symbol in Hinduism. Many Indian women wear a small round red dot in the middle of the forehead to indicate that they are married. And some wear a black dot to ward off evil prior to marriage. Some regard the red dot as a generic symbol of one's Hindu faith, as worn by both men and women. Hindus in Europe and the United States sometimes have difficulty deciding whether to wear the dot in public or whether to confine its use to worship. As with so many personal religious symbols, it has become associated with issues of religious distinctiveness and cultural assimilation. Some believe the dot alludes to Shiva's third eye, a symbol of wisdom and divine power. Shaivites often wear 3 parallel horizontal lines on the forehead, and often on upper arms and on the chest as well. The marks are sometimes made with paint and sometimes with ash to symbolize cremation. Vaishnavites wear what appears to be a large V or double V on the forehead and sometimes on the upper arm.
Are number, color, or nature symbolism important in Daoist tradition and CCT?
Astrological calculation and cosmological imagery have long been an integral part of Chinese religious views. Hundreds of symbolic elements make up this vast system of correspondences. Zodiacal animals are associated with the 12 months. Each of the 4 quadrants of the universe has its 7 constellations in addition to its connection with specific trigrams, all related to particular aspects of good fortune or difficulty. Each of these elements is further coordinated with one of the 5 symbolic colors: black, white, red, green, yellow, and elements: wood, water, earth, metal, fire, and organs of the human body. Here are some examples of popular animal symbolism. The crow, surprisingly perhaps, symbolizes the sun. The crane, guide of the immortals, means long life, as do the dove and the hare. Fish are reminders of renewal of life and abundance. By association with plowing new fields, the ox means spring and vitality. The sharp-eyed, quick-tongued parrot looks after faithfulness in marriage. Flowers, trees, and fruits almost always have some symbolic resonance. The springtime peony means tenderness and womanly beauty, as does the jasmine. The plum means winter and reminds of Lao Zi, who was born beneath a plum tree. Bamboo betokens endurance, the orange benevolence. A complete listing would fill several books. Of course, not everyone thinks consciously of specific symbolic meanings upon seeing any of the hundreds of visual decorative motifs in the full catalogue. But most Chinese still grow up surrounded by countless symbolic associations of this kind.
What are the three bodies of the Buddha?
The concept of the three bodies, Trikaya, of the Buddha evolved as a way of explaining how the spiritual entity called the Buddha nature could transcend all earthly realities and at the same time manifest itself in the world. Pure Buddha nature existed in the Dharma body and was personified as the primal or universal Buddha, living in various heavenly abodes that made up the bliss body were the five principal meditational Buddhas. 1 ruling the center and 4 ruling the paradises at the 4 cardinal points. Transcendent Bodhisattvas assisted the celestial Buddhas in the work of salvation through grace. Involved in earthly affairs were the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who entered history in the manifestation body, subjecting themselves to time and change out of compassion for all suffering beings.
Is there a standard Buddhist liturgical worship?
Buddhist denominations that emphasize communal worship exhibit considerable variation in their services. Recitation of sacred texts is the single most common element. One Japanese Pure Land denomination uses the following order of service. After a call to worship expressing prayerful intent, worshippers pronounce the 3 refuges. Invoke the presence of the Buddha, praise him. Make a symbolic confession of sins, and recite the name of Amida Buddha 10 times. Then follows a segment of scriptural chanting, explicitly dedicated to rebirth in the Pure Land. Again invoking the name of Amida Buddha 10 times, worshippers reflect on its deeper meaning. Between 2 further invocations of the name they recite from the teachings of founder Honen. After a recitation of the vows of the Bodhisattva, the ritual concludes with the 3 refuges and a final prayer to send the Buddha back to his heavenly abode.
What is the nature of the human person in Confucian tradition?
Chinese uses the word seeing to describe human nature in its most fundamental form. The term combines the concepts of life/progeny with heart/mind. The two basic constituents of the person. Confucius further described the fully developed person using the term ren, a Chinese word that combines the characters for human being and tu. A full person, therefore, is one who exists in society, in communication with others. Human beings are always works in progress, ever shaping themselves in pursuit of an elusive goal of perfection. Ren, sometimes translated as goodness, human-heartedness, or even love, is that which activates the other four of the so-called five great virtues: devotion, justice, wisdom, and propriety. Only in light of Ren does law function properly, as a guide rather than as a straitjacket. Ren's two components, Yung, individual, and Shu, the virtue of reciprocity, allow human beings to enact the principles known as the mean, the ability to hold feelings in abeyance, and the measure, by which one can express emotions in balance.
What is a Rashi?
The Japanese term Rashi means old, i.e. venerable, teacher. It is the title of the spiritual master in Zen monasteries. Monks admitted to the Zen life must submit themselves entirely to the direction of the Rashi. However harsh and unrelenting his discipline may seem. Regular activities in which Rashi and monks encounter each other include the master's instructions to the group and monks' individual sessions in the Rashi's room. A Rashi's instructions, Taisho, Koza, take place in a lecture hall. Accompanied by two assistant monks, the Rashi burns incense before the Buddha image. After the monks recite sacred texts, the Rashi assumes his teaching chair and teaches for about an hour. Using short narratives and parables and concluding with a specific case of the issue he has been discussing. The monks are left to ponder the matter in depth. During the week-long retreats, called Dai-Sesshin, the Great Collecting Thoughts, that occur monthly during the traditional rainy season seclusion, the Rashi gives instructions daily. Ordinarily, individual monks will have the opportunity for voluntary individual sessions with the Rashi at regular intervals during the course of daily order. But during the Dai-Sesshin they will each see him briefly 4 times daily to discuss their koan or their progress in meditation. These sessions, called sanzen, are not a simple chat. There is no small talk with the Rashi. In a few choice words, the monk signals to the teacher whether he is making genuine progress. If he talks nonsense, the Rashi will toss him out unceremoniously with an admonition to get serious. One of Zen's greatest teachers, Dogen, 1200-53, described the ideal Rashi as able to transmit the Dharma. Warm but able to be harsh when necessary, standing in the Buddha's place in educating. Humble enough to ask his monks forgiveness, uninterested in fame or prestige, and concerned above all with simplicity. When it seems appropriate, the monk and the Rashi might even share a hearty laugh.
How do religious traditions settle on the contents of their scriptures?
Scripture-centered traditions sometimes take centuries to decide definitively the question of which important texts to include in the category of Scripture and which to exclude. The overall process is called the formation of a canon. Sacred texts eventually proclaimed canonical carry considerably greater authority than those excluded from the scriptural canon. In some cases we know relatively little about the process itself. And in many instances we are not entirely certain when a given tradition fixed its canon. For the majority of the larger traditions, the process of canon formation seems to stretch across many generations. In the case of Islamic scripture, which developed over a fairly short time and is traditionally associated with only one person, the process appears at first to have been rather straightforward. But even there, recent scholarship has begun to uncover details that suggest a different picture.
Can women exercise religious leadership among Hindus?
Women's roles in Hindu tradition have varied enormously over its long history. During the Vedic period, women apparently participated directly in many major rituals and exercised exclusive leadership in some. As the Brahmanic priesthood rose to prominence, women had fewer opportunities for official leadership. But women have continued to play major roles in many religious rituals outside the Brahmanic system. They often lead women's groups in communal prayer and song in gatherings connected with local observances. Some Brahmin women have functioned as itinerant preachers in rural areas. Others have become specialists, called pundits, in ritual and lore. Perhaps the best known are the women whose role as gurus has attracted seekers and devotees, often from great distances, to take darshan, that is, to be in their presence, and benefit from their counsel.
What are Muslim sermons like?
An address called the khutbah, pronounced khutbah, is a standard feature of every Friday congregational prayer service. Members of the congregation sit on the floor while the preacher stands near the niche, mihrab, or ascends a few steps of a pulpit called the minbar, pronounced minbar. In larger, more established mosques, the imam generally delivers the sermon on Fridays at the early afternoon congregational prayer. But either the imam or some other adult might also offer some reflections at other times when smaller groups gather for salat. Speakers have a wide range of appropriate topics from which to choose. High on the list are ethical concerns such as social responsibility, the need for parents to take an active part in their children's education, and speaking out in public venues about problems that need attention from concerned citizens. Speakers might also choose any of scores of devotional themes, such as cultivating one's relationship with God, or the need to set aside time for personal reading and reflection on the Quran. Preachers often tailor their sermons to a specific religious season, especially during Ramadan and pilgrimage season. Encouragement during the month-long fast is always helpful and welcome. Scripture naturally plays a major part in sermons, and preachers generally cite hadiths along with Quranic texts to illustrate their themes. Sermons vary in length from 5 or 10 minutes to perhaps a half hour for special occasions.
How do Hindus view Hinduism's relationships to other traditions?
For many centuries the greater Hindu tradition has shown enormous flexibility in adapting to religious pluralism. It came to be the greater Hinduism, in part at least, because of that quality of expansiveness. Many Hindus regard their religious heritage as a kind of spiritual umbrella capable of sheltering all who seek refuge beneath it. Historically, different denominations have drawn once separate traditions into their embrace. For example, Vaishnavite tradition came to incorporate Buddhism by installing the Buddha as the ninth of Vishnu's 10 avatars, a hospitable gesture, perhaps, but one that Buddhists do not recognize. Some Hindus have suggested that Jesus and other foundational figures also find a place in the greater Hindu scheme of things. A major early modern movement that began as an attempt to soften the animosity between Hindus and Muslims in northwestern India especially is now known as Sikhism. The Sikh community has become largely identified with a region called the Punjab, which straddles the India-Pakistan border. Sikh separatists have continued to assert their desire for a homeland.
What is the Jewish calendar?
The Jewish calendar is lunisolar, that is, it is regulated by the positions of both the moon and the sun. There are 12 alternating lunar months of 29 and 30 days each. The year totals 353, 354, or 355 days. Leap years are introduced to conform to the solar year of 365.25 days. Leap years contain an extra 30-day period called First Adar. Leap years contain either 383, 384, or 385 days and occur 7 times in every 19-year period. This is called the metonic cycle. Thus, the number of days in a given year is not fixed and may vary from 353 to 385 days. And the first day of the month can fall on any day of the week and will vary from year to year.
What is the harrowing of hell?
According to ancient Christian creeds, Jesus Christ descended into hell after his death on the cross. Some traditions associate this curious visit to the abyss or nether world with Christ's ultimate victory over evil as well as death. But the majority opinion is that Christ descended not into hell, the place or state of eternal torment and punishment, but to that intermediate realm in which all just persons who had died previously awaited the coming of Christ. According to that view, Christ descended in order to lead those righteous souls heavenward.
How are Shinto leaders chosen and given authority?
Shinto priesthood has historically been a hereditary occupation. Even after the government officially took over the appointment of chief priests after 1868. Hereditary succession continued in many localities. Perhaps the most important ingredients in maintaining standards among Shinto officials are the two educational institutions now solely responsible for the training of priests. Tokyo's Kokyugakuen, National Learning University, is a relatively recent development. A private university that offers general education as well as the equivalent of Shinto seminary curriculum. It supplies research for the present centralized shrine authority, the Jinjiya Honcho. The Kagaken, Imperial Hall of Learning, University near Ise was originally a public institution that closed after World War II and then reopened in 1952 as a private university. Priests to be study Japanese history and literature, but focus on Shinto studies, especially ritual and theology. Shinto priests are not ordained clergy, strictly speaking. They are laypersons granted certification or licensure upon satisfactory completion of the seminary curriculum and its qualifying exams.
Do Jews revere any persons as especially gifted with wisdom?
Wisdom has always had a special place in Jewish tradition. King Solomon, for all his faults, has occupied the place of honor in this respect. In the biblical story of how two women came to him, both claiming a child as theirs, Solomon responds by decreeing that the child be cut in half. At that the child's true mother offered to save the baby's life by letting the other woman have the infant. Solomon then gave the child to its mother. Tradition says Solomon wrote a number of the wisdom books in the Hebrew Bible, as well as few extra-canonical or apocryphal works. Since Solomon's time, the custodians of the tradition's treasures of wisdom have been known generically as sages. They have included largely religious scholars and rabbis, such as Hillel and the legendary Rabbi Akiva, c. 50-135, and Yohanan ben Zakkai, c. 1-80 CE. According to legend, Moses went to heaven for a preview of the Torah and asked God whether his works would prosper. God showed Moses a vision of a future disciple named Akiva. His lecture was so profound that even Moses could not understand it. The centrality of the sages in Jewish spirituality is indicative of the importance of practical wisdom in the tradition. Wisdom is the highest form of holiness.
Did Shinto tradition spread beyond Japan?
Shinto has gone as far as Japanese emigration and military expansion have carried that ancient tradition. You'll see the occasional Shinto shrine in various parts of the Pacific Basin even now. Reminders of a time when Japan projected its imperial presence beyond its shores. Where Japanese communities have taken root and continue to grow, especially during the last 50 years or so. Older people especially take comfort in celebrating at the nearest shrine for festivals. But on the whole, Shinto has remained about as purely Japanese a phenomenon as one can imagine. Even in parts of the United States, for example, where now sizable communities of Japanese descent make their homes. Traditional Shinto priests are exceedingly rare. Some suggest that Shinto anywhere but in Japan is a contradiction in terms. Shinto remains, ideally, a tradition inseparable from the very soil of Japan and its sacred streams, groves, and mountains.
What is a beatitude?
A beatitude is a blessing proclaimed by Jesus in the New Testament, Matthew 5:3-11, Luke 6:20-23. Commending a characteristic of life that is most precious and dear to God. Jesus pronounced the Beatitudes at the very beginning of his public ministry. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Blessed are those persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
What other early scriptures are especially important for Shinto practitioners? Is there a Shinto scriptural canon?
Scholars refer to the various sacred texts collectively as Shinton, texts of the deities. But although they generally agree on the importance of a certain set of works, there has never been an official process of canonization by which representatives of the tradition have formally declared certain texts as definitive. Here are the most important of the classical documents. From the early 8th century, the Fudoki, records of wind and earth, provided data about very early religious rituals from major shrines. The early 9th century Kogoshui, 807, or gleaning of ancient words commented on previous Documents in an attempt to legitimate the Imbe family against their enemies, the Nakatomi clan. The Manyoshu, collection of countless leaves, anthologizes a large selection of 7th and 8th century Japanese poetry of various genres. Some Shinto scholars have insisted that these poems represent the purest form of Japanese literary expression. First published in 927, the Enji Shiki includes a collection of more than 24 prayer texts. A work called the Kyojiki, also Sendai Kyoji Hangi, or Records of Ancient Happenings, bears the date 620 but was probably contrived as late as the 9th century to compete with the similar sounding Kojiki in antiquity and authority. It amounts to what some traditions might call an apocryphal work, not what it claims to be, but still full of valuable material. Finally, a group of 13th century texts called the Five Shinto Scriptures. Shinto Gobusho, emphasize the antiquity of Japan's Shinto heritage. 17th century scholars who studied these texts as prime examples of Japanese culture and values went on to spearhead the national learning school of thought.
Are any feasts dedicated especially to the goddesses?
Durga Puja, also called Navaratri, 9 nights, occurs at the fall equinox in honor of Shiva's consort Durga. As the slayer of the buffalo demon, Durga Mahishasura Mardani. Durga represents the power of good to quell all sources of evil. Devotees celebrate this deity's complete protection of her worshippers. But Durga's festival has room for other deities as well. The first day celebrates the goddess Sarasvati, patroness of learning and beauty. In some regions the 5th day belongs to a goddess called Lalita. Bengalis sometimes still sacrifice water buffalo in honor of Durga's cosmic victory over evil. Another festival, occurring at the end of winter to welcome spring, is called Shri Panchami, goddess 5th day in the bright half of Magha. Devotees honor Sarasvati by piling up books and symbols of learning near local altars. Other days, such as several during the extended feast called Diwali, also belong to the major goddesses.
What is the perfect realization school of Daoism?
Founded by Wang Zhe, c. 1123 to 1170, also called Wang Chongyang, the perfect realization. Chuanzhen school is among the most important Daoist monastic orders. According to legend, Wang Zhe received new revelations from one of the 8 immortals, Lu Dongbin. Ascetic self-denial was a central feature in the order's discipline, including meditative practices designed to maximize yang energy and minimize yin. The founder evidently insisted on the importance of studying the teachings of Buddhism and Confucianism along with those of Daoism. but focused on the characteristically Daoist spiritual goal of immortality. Of its several branches, the Lung Men, Dragon Gate, is perhaps the most influential. Like religious orders in some other major traditions, the Perfect Realization Order historically has been socially active and responsible for preserving much traditional Chinese religious culture in times of turmoil. For example, they have done extensive refugee relief work and published a major edition of the Daoist scriptural canon in 1192. From the White Cloud Monastery in Beijing. The Lung Men branch of the order continues its work today.
What are some of the main types of religious officials or specialists?
Most traditions develop distinctive roles for specialists in the practice and preservation of ritual, the interpretation and implementation of rules, the works of teaching and pastoral guidance, and internal services and social outreach. In some traditions, a single individual sometimes plays multiple roles, depending on the size of the local community. Division of labor typically occurs in larger communities and often requires extensive financial support. Ritual specialists play a crucial role in most traditions, but particularly in those having elaborate liturgies or other ritual practices. Some traditions, such as Hinduism, Roman Catholicism, and Shinto, maintain full-time priestly staffs at their larger institutions whose task is to serve the community and see that the main rituals are handed down intact. Traditions that have their own internal systems of law often train legal specialists for extensive administrative duties. Communities that establish their own educational systems often train teachers, administrators, and directors of religious education for their schools. Members of some traditions also look to their specialists for pastoral guidance in time of difficulty. Some religious leaders take on the role of counselor or spiritual guide, helping individuals and families through crises such as grieving or loss of employment. Related to these services are a host of community-based activities that, in larger local communities, can require a full-time director or social worker.
What is the main source of information on Lao Zi's life?
The main source of information on Lao Zi's life is a biography written by the historian Si Ma Chen, 145-86b. CE, in his Records of the Historian. By this time a number of beliefs about the founder of Chinese Daoism were circulating, and Si Ma Chen himself was unsure of their authenticity. The biography, in fact, contains an account of not one, but three, men called Lao Zi. The first Lao Zi was a man named Li Er or Lao Dan who came from the village of Churen in the southern Chinese state of Chu. Li Er served as historian in charge of the official archives in the Chinese imperial capital of Luoyang. He was a contemporary of Confucius and is reported to have granted an interview to the Confucian master when he came to Luoyang seeking information on the Zhou ritual. Another man identified as the founder of Daoism was Lao Lai Zi, who also came from Chu. He is designated as a contemporary of Confucius and is credited with a 15-chapter book expounding on the teachings of the Daoist school. Nothing more is known about him. According to a third account, the original Lao Zi lived 129 years after the death of Confucius. This man went by the name of Tan, the historian of Zhou. Scroll volumes. Every imaginable variety of text is available in the modern 60-volume reprint of the canon. 12 subdivisions arrange the material as follows: primal revelations, talismans, scriptural interpretation, or exegesis, sacred diagrams, historical texts, ethical texts, ritual texts, practical techniques, biographical information, sacred songs, and memorials. Most of the various sects and schools of Daoism focus on one or a select few of the many possibilities the canon offers. As we shall see later, recitation or chanting of sacred texts forms an important part of some ritual observances.
Is nonviolence particularly important in Hindu beliefs?
Leaders familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. may recall that he spoke of being especially influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's teachings on nonviolent resistance. Concern for ahimsa, non-injury, including respect for all forms of life, seems to have become an important theme in Hindu tradition following the rise of Buddhism and Jainism in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. Ahimsa ranks first among a list of 10 spiritual qualities, called yamas, or restraints, in the classical system of yoga attributed to Patanjali. Avoidance of all injury, in word and deed, began with the rejection of Vedic sacrifice and as a central practice of small groups of ascetics and grew to include the practice of vegetarianism.
Are statues and other visual imagery important in Daoist and CCT temples?
With the notable exception of major Confucian and imperial temples, Chinese ritual spaces are almost always filled with images of deities and other sacred figures. Principal deities occupy main altar spaces, but they often share the central spot with smaller images of other sacred figures arranged below the main image and toward the front of the altar. For many centuries, Daoists and practitioners of CCT evidently felt no need for anthropomorphic depictions of their deities. The advent of Buddhism, with its growing iconographic repertoire, seems to have been an important factor in the development of Chinese religious representational imagery. Images of Daoist deities, and of those that originated outside Daoist circles but are often identified as Daoist by association, run a wide gamut. Some of the deities are of divine origin. Others began as human beings, either historical or legendary, and achieved divine status either in life or after death. In addition to statues, colorful banners, low relief in stone and other media, and mural paintings depict mythological and other scenes meant to keep the worshipper in the proper frame of mind. Even temples that began as Buddhist institutions and which still display distinctively Buddhist imagery in their main shrines and altars have often become transformed into CCT temples by accretion over the centuries. Whatever the individual deity's life history, anthropomorphic images abound.
Are there religious hierarchical structures in any branch of Buddhism?
Early Buddhist teaching replaced the caste system's dramatic social and religious stratification with an egalitarian ideal. Be a lamp unto your own feet, the Buddha counseled his followers. His rejection of a mediating priesthood made the Buddha a sort of Protestant reformer. He wanted the life of the Sangha to represent a perfectly level playing field. In practice, the elevation of the monastic life over that of the laity introduced a kind of stratification into Buddhist life. Within the early monastic community, seniority alone distinguished one member from another. As the Sangha expanded and the itinerant mendicants began to settle into fixed residences, monastic life became more complex and required a division of labor. Though many decisions were taken by a monastic council, a de facto hierarchy developed. At the top was the abbot, assisted by spiritual guides and preceptors chosen from among the senior monks. The majority of the community was made up of senior monks and nuns and novices. In addition, many of the denominations eventually took on a semblance of hierarchical organization. But there is a major difference between the function of such organizational structures in Buddhist institutions and parallels in traditions like Roman Catholicism and Shiite Islam. Buddhist hierarchies seem to evolve as a result of internal structural needs rather than as a result of doctrine. Traditions that teach the need for mediators between ordinary people and the ultimate sources of truth and spiritual power develop hierarchical structures for theoretical as well as practical reasons.
Are there distinctive forms of Hindu initiation?
Boys of the twice-born castes are initiated into the tradition in special ceremonies called Upanayana, which mark the beginning of formal instruction in sacred learning. The initiate receives a thread and wears it draped across the shoulder as a symbol of this second birth. Women no longer receive the thread and only Brahmins nowadays wear it when not engaged in ritual ceremonies. Sacred threads are of white wool for Brahmins, of red hemp for Kshatriyas, and of yellow wool for Vaishyas. Tradition dictated that Brahmins be initiated at 7 or 8 years of age. Kshatriyas at 11, and Vase Hyas at 12. But regardless of caste, most of those who still engage in the formal ceremony generally associate it with puberty.
What is the significance of keeping kosher?
Kashrut is the Hebrew term for the use of ritually pure, kasher, food. It refers to the way food is prepared as well as to certain types of food. With respect to manner of preparation, the opposite of kasher is terfa. Torn by a predator, rather than properly butchered. The basic principle here is that an animal's death by predator constitutes a defect in the animal product. Proper butchering, called shehita, involves using only perfectly smooth blades to slit the animal's throat and windpipe, draining the blood, and inspecting for blemishes. With respect to types of food, Jews make a number of major distinctions between what is clean and what is unclean. Clean animals include cattle, sheep, and other ruminants with fully cloven hooves, but not non-ruminant mammals or those with solid or only partly cloven hooves, such as dogs or horses. Clean birds include pigeons, doves, chickens, pheasant, and domestically raised geese and ducks, but not birds of prey, wild waterfowl, or most other common wild birds. All reptiles and amphibians are unclean, but fish with scales and internal bones, as opposed to cartilage, as with shark, are acceptable. In addition, expanding on the biblical prohibition of cooking a kid in its mother's milk, Exodus 34:26, dairy and meat products may not be combined in any way. Strict observers of kashrut keep separate sets of kitchen tools, some even totally separate kitchens for meats and dairy products. Kosher practice is an excellent example of the distinction between custom and ritual. Observance of dietary laws often involves, or presupposes, precise ritual action, such as in the kosher method of slaughtering an animal or the care taken not to contaminate utensils. But in general it means simply a customary way of handling food that has religious implications.
Why is archaeology important in the study of religion?
Archaeology is the study of material evidence of cultures and civilizations past. It offers us a vast reservoir of data from which to reconstruct, tentatively at least, the stories of how our ancestors lived and what they believed. Armed with trowels and teaspoons, whisk brooms, and toothbrushes, archaeologists painstakingly unearth layer upon layer of dwellings, cities, libraries, and places of worship. Without the hard data of archaeology, much of our knowledge of the story of religion would be sheer speculation. Unfortunately, because human beings have so often made their homes right on top of earlier settlements, much of that data will remain buried forever. Still, there is no danger archaeologists will run out of work. Since hundreds of thousands of accessible major sites await a chance to unfold whole new chapters of the story.
But why formulate a body of doctrine at all?
Some traditions equate religious community with conformity of belief. Doctrine arises out of a desire to hold it all together and keep the tradition's inaugural insight as pure as possible. Doctrine is a measure of the role of authority in a religious tradition and provides a framework within which to pass along the content of the faith and to protect practices of ritual and worship from losing their distinctive character. Dogma, from the Greek verb dokein, to think or to seem good, can also refer generally to a belief or opinion. But in religious studies, dogma refers to a further specification of the category of doctrine. In some religious traditions, a teaching body or authority may deem it necessary under certain historical circumstances to clarify a particular doctrine. For example, suppose that the Buddhist monks in a certain region have gradually modified their interpretation of older ways of living the monastic life. Members of the larger Buddhist tradition might determine that they need to convene a council for the purpose of reaffirming and reinstating ancient practice. One can imagine other scenarios as well. When a tradition's core teachings come under attack, whether from within or without, or when changing times put undue pressure on traditional mores, those in leadership may decide corrective action is necessary. The result of the action is called dogma. Finally, there is another important point to keep in mind, just as not all traditions possess specific creedal formulations. Not all traditions have elaborated distinctive bodies of doctrine. Of those that do so, only some take the further, more elaborate step of defining particular doctrines as dogma. In other words, non-creedal, non-theological traditions generally do not develop systems of beliefs that might function as litmus test indicators of a believer's compliance with mainstream views.
Does Daoism have any annual celebrations?
For virtually every temple community, the principal deity's birthday provides the occasion for a major yearly festivity. Celebrants focus on the temple and the main icon, sprucing up the building and decking out the deity in new finery. In addition, there are dozens of other special days. The New Year emphasizes fresh start, with Lao Zi's feast on the first day and special prayers to the Jade Pure One on the 8th and the Jade Emperor on the 9th day of the first month. The latter is a lengthy festivity that culminates on the 15th with the Lantern Festival. Clear and bright falls on the first day of the third month. In mainland China this is not lunar but occurs always on April 5. Its main thrust is to remember the dead, maintain burial places, and offer ritual meals at the graves. Dragon boat races on the 5th day of the 5th month commemorate the drowning of a poet of old. More important, however, is the association of that month with the need to ward off spirits of disease at a time when, with the summer solstice approaching, yin energy begins to replace yang as the dominant energy. CCT devotees celebrate Guan Yin's ascension to heaven on the 19th of the 6th month, during which people also mark the midpoint in the year. On the 7th day of the 7th month, people observe the only night when the weaving maid and the cowherd, a celestial couple, can be together. And the 15th marks the birthday of a deist deity called the Earth Controller, known in CCT as the Emperor Sage Shun. Numerous rituals acknowledging the need to placate the wandering dead occupy many during the 7th month. Most prominent is the Ghost Festival on the 15th day, when people seek to propitiate the spirits by leaving food out for them. Deist masters now officiate at the occasion, which was formerly a Buddhist observance. A mid-autumn celebration of the moon goddess's birthday. Once a harvest festival, occurs on the 15th of the 8th month. On the 9th day of the 9th month, called double yang because of the auspicious nature of the number 9. People once sought protection in amulets and fled lowland evil by taking to the hills. Nowadays, most people simply go for walks in the cool fresh autumn air. On the 15th of month 10, worshippers mark the birthday of a deist deity called the Controller of the Waters, known in CCT as the Sage Yu. A winter festivity marks the solstice during the 11th month. Before the 12th month is even half spent, planning begins for the new year.